the morning after my wedding, before the coffee had finished brewing and before the sun fully climbed over the neighboring rooftops, I found my suitcases dumped in the hallway like trash waiting for pickup. And in that moment, I realized marrying a man without revealing who I truly was had just saved me from the biggest mistake of my life. If stories about hidden strength, quiet revenge, and second chances later in life speak to you, take a moment now to subscribe, because what happened next still feels unreal even as I tell it. I was 55 years old when I married Victor, an age when most people think surprises are behind you and life has already shown all its cards. I had lived, lost, buried a good husband, raised a child, and built something with my own hands that I kept carefully hidden behind sensible shoes and modest dresses. When Victor and I met, I let him believe I was simply the building manager of the apartment complex where I lived. A widow with a steady but unremarkable income and a quiet routine. He liked that about me, or at least he said he did. He said he admired my simplicity, my lack of ambition, my gratitude for small things. In truth, he admired what he thought was weakness. Victor came with 2 adult sons, Aaron and Luke, both loud, confident, and permanently convinced the world owed them something. From the beginning, they treated my apartment like a temporary stop, already talking about renovations, rentals, and how the place could be improved if only it were owned by someone with vision. I smiled and nodded, playing my part, reminding myself why I stayed silent. I wanted to know who Victor was when he thought I had nothing to offer but companionship. The wedding was small, almost rushed, held at the community hall down the street. Victor insisted we keep costs low, joked about not needing a big show at our age. I agreed, watching how quickly he pocketed the envelope my sister discreetly handed him as a gift. That night, he drank too much. His sons laughed too loudly, and I went to bed with a knot in my stomach I tried to ignore. The next morning, I woke to shouting, doors slamming, and the sharp scrape of luggage wheels against concrete. I opened my door to see my bags lined up in the hallway, my clothes spilling out like evidence. Victor stood there, arms crossed, jaw tight, his sons behind him smirking, as if this were a long-planned joke. He told me, calmly and coldly, that this arrangement was not going to work, that he had thought things over, and that it would be better if I moved out. He said the apartment was too small for all of us, that his sons needed space, and that since I was just the building manager, surely I could find another place nearby. I remember the way his voice carried a strange confidence, like he believed marriage had given him authority. My heart hurt, but my hands were steady. I asked him if he was serious, and he shrugged, saying it was nothing personal, just practical. His sons laughed, already discussing which room would become a home office. I looked at the walls I had paid for, the floors I had chosen, the building I had bought decades earlier with savings and sacrifice, and I felt something inside me settle instead of shatter. I picked up one suitcase, not to leave, but to close it. I told Victor he should sit down, because there were things he needed to understand about where he was standing. He rolled his eyes, clearly thinking this was a plea. What he did not know, what none of them knew, was that the woman they thought they could discard owned not just the apartment, but the entire complex, every brick and beam, free and clear. I had hidden my wealth, not out of shame, but out of caution, learned from years of watching people change the moment they thought they could take from you. That hallway, filled with my belongings, became the stage where truth finally stepped into the light, and where 3 men learned how expensive arrogance can be. Victor laughed when I asked him to sit down, that short, dismissive sound people make when they believe they already hold the upper hand. and he told me there was nothing to discuss because the decision had been made. Aaron leaned against the wall, scrolling his phone. Luke kicked one of my bags aside with his foot, as if checking its weight. And I remember thinking how quickly people reveal themselves when they think you are powerless. I told Victor I wasn't going anywhere, not today, not ever. And that was when his face changed. He stepped closer, lowered his voice, and reminded me that I didn't own anything here, that I was just lucky he had married me, and that he could make things very uncomfortable if I didn't cooperate. I looked past him, through the glass doors, out into the courtyard, where tenants were starting their mornings, and I thought about the years I had spent building a life that did not depend on anyone's permission. I told him the truth calmly, without drama, that I owned the complex, all 12 buildings, the parking lot, the retail strip at the front, every lease, every utility contract. All of it. For a second, none of them reacted. Then Victor laughed again, louder this time, telling his sons I was having some kind of breakdown. Luke joined in, mocking me, asking which part I owned, the hallway or the mop closet. I didn't raise my voice. I simply walked to the small office near the entrance, unlocked the filing cabinet, and brought out the deed, the original purchase agreement, and the property tax statements with my name printed clearly across the top. I placed them on the kitchen table, one by one. The room went quiet in a way that felt heavy, like air before a storm. Victor picked up the papers, flipping through them too quickly at first, then slower, his face draining of color. Aaron leaned over his shoulder, his confident grin slipping. Luke stopped laughing altogether. I watched understanding crawl across their faces, followed by disbelief, then something darker. Victor asked why I would lie, his voice sharp now, accusing me of trickery, as if hiding my wealth was some kind of crime against him. I told him I never lied. I told him exactly what my job was, managing the building I owned, and that if he had asked, I would have answered. He slammed the papers down and said this changed things, that as my husband he had rights, that we could work this out if I was willing to be reasonable. The word reasonable hung there, heavy with implication. His sons immediately shifted gears, suddenly polite, suddenly interested in conversation, talking about family, about working together, about expanding the business. The speed of their transformation made my stomach turn. Just hours earlier, they had treated me like an inconvenience, and now they spoke to me like an investment opportunity. I told them all to leave my apartment. Victor protested, saying we were married, that this was his home too. I reminded him that marriage does not transfer property ownership overnight, especially when the owner has been threatened with eviction less than an hour earlier. I gave him 30 minutes to collect his things. He tried every tactic he could think of: guilt, anger, charm, even tears, telling me he had acted out of stress, that he hadn't meant it, that his sons had pressured him. I listened without interrupting, noting how every apology was followed by a condition. When the 30 minutes were up, I called my lawyer, the same woman who had helped me structure the property years before, and put her on speaker. She explained Victor's position in very clear legal terms, leaving no room for argument. The sons went silent. Victor's shoulders slumped. They packed quickly after that, the hallway reversing its earlier scene, their bags now lining the floor, their footsteps heavy and uncertain. As they left, Victor turned and asked if this was really how I wanted to start our marriage. I told him it was not how I started it, but it was certainly how it ended. When the door closed behind them, I sat down at the table, surrounded by documents and silence, and allowed myself one long breath. I had tested a truth I already knew, that people who love you for who you are do not try to discard you the moment they think you have nothing left to give. The building felt different once they were gone. Not emptier, exactly, but calmer, like a room after a storm has passed through and taken the worst of the noise with it. I spent that day walking the complex, greeting tenants, checking maintenance requests, doing the same things I had always done. Except now every step felt heavier with the weight of what had almost happened. People waved, smiled, asked how married life was treating me, and I smiled back, saying it was educational. By evening, my phone began to ring. First Victor, then numbers I didn't recognize, then his sister, then a cousin, all wanting to talk, to explain, to smooth things over. I let them all go to voicemail. That night, I sat alone on my balcony and thought about how easily I could have lost everything if I had believed the version of myself Victor seemed so comfortable dismissing. I remembered the early days of buying the complex, when the bank manager had spoken slowly to me as if I might not understand, when contractors had tried to overcharge me, when people assumed a middle-aged woman had no business owning property of that size. Those memories no longer stung. They reminded me why I trusted my instincts. The next morning, I woke to an email from Victor, long and dramatic, apologizing again, saying he had panicked, that he felt insecure, that his sons had influenced him, that he loved me. I read it carefully, noticing how the apology still centered on his feelings, his fear, his loss. There was no acknowledgement of my fear, my humiliation, or the fact that he had tried to remove me from my own home less than 24 hours after promising partnership. I replied briefly, telling him I would be filing for annulment and that all further communication should go through my lawyer. The response was immediate and angry, accusing me of overreacting, of embarrassing him, of wasting his time. I felt nothing reading it, just a quiet confirmation that I was doing the right thing. Over the following weeks, the story spread, not in the way gossip usually does, but in fragments, whispered between tenants, neighbors, and acquaintances. Some people praised me, calling me smart, saying they wished they had done the same when they were younger. Others questioned why I had hidden my wealth, suggesting I had invited trouble. I listened to all of it, understanding that people interpret stories through the lens of their own regrets. One afternoon, as I was reviewing lease renewals in my office, a young woman named Carla knocked on the door. She lived in Building C and had always been polite but distant. She told me she had heard what happened and wanted to thank me. She said watching me stand up for myself had given her courage to leave a relationship where she was constantly belittled. Her words stayed with me longer than any criticism. Around the same time, Victor's sons tried a different approach. Aaron emailed me a business proposal, suggesting we meet to discuss a partnership, pretending the eviction incident had never happened. Luke sent a message saying he hoped there were no hard feelings and that family should stick together. I forwarded both messages to my lawyer and blocked their numbers. The annulment process was straightforward, but emotionally draining. Each document another reminder of how quickly trust can be misplaced. During one meeting, Victor tried one last time to speak to me directly, waiting outside the office, his posture smaller than I remembered. He told me he felt humiliated, that people were laughing at him, that he had never meant to hurt me. I told him quietly that humiliation comes from one's own actions, not from being exposed. I wished him well and walked past him without looking back. As weeks turned into months, life settled into a new rhythm. I hosted a small dinner for my tenants, something I had always planned but postponed, and listened as people shared their stories, their struggles, their small victories. I realized how much community I had built without ever needing to announce my success. Late one evening, my sister asked if I regretted hiding the truth, if things might have been different had Victor known from the start. I thought about it carefully before answering. I told her that if a man only respects you when he believes you have money, then knowing sooner would not have changed who he was, only how long it took him to show it. Standing in that hallway, watching my bags on the floor, had been painful, but it had also been clarifying. It had shown me exactly who I had married and exactly who I was. In the months that followed, something unexpected happened inside me. Something quieter than relief, but stronger than anger. I began to feel an expanding sense of ownership over my own story. Not just the buildings or the business, but the narrative I had allowed others to assume about me. For years, I had been content to let people underestimate me, believing it gave me peace. Now I understood it had also given me invisibility. And while invisibility can be protective, it can also invite disrespect. I didn't regret my choice, but I became more intentional about how I carried myself. When contractors spoke to me, I corrected them without apology. When bankers addressed questions to my male accountant instead of me, I redirected the conversation calmly and firmly. The complex began a renovation project that summer. New lighting, improved security, fresh paint. And as I walked through the property with the project manager, I felt grounded in a way I hadn't in years. One afternoon, while reviewing blueprints, I ran into Mrs. Hernandez from Building A, a woman in her 70s who had lived there since before I bought the place. She squeezed my hand and told me she was proud of me, not just for owning the buildings, but for knowing when to let go of a man who didn't deserve space in my life. Her words carried a weight that surprised me. I realized how often older women are expected to accept whatever companionship comes their way, as if dignity has an expiration date. The annulment finalized quietly, without drama, a stack of papers signed and filed, closing a chapter that had burned bright and brief. Victor stopped trying to contact me after that, and the silence felt like a clean break rather than a loss. I began attending events I had previously skipped, business mixers, local council meetings, even a property owners' association luncheon where I spoke openly about tenant rights and long-term investment. People listened, not because I demanded attention, but because I spoke with experience. There were moments when I caught myself thinking about Victor, not with longing, but with curiosity, wondering how he explained the situation to himself now that the narrative of victimhood no longer fit. Those thoughts passed quickly. My focus shifted to my own growth. I enrolled in a course on sustainable property management, not because I needed it, but because learning felt like reclaiming something. One evening, as I sorted through old photos, I found one of my late first husband, smiling, paint on his hands from a weekend renovation project. He had known about the complex, supported every step, never once tried to claim it as his own. I understood then how stark the contrast was, and how easily familiarity can blind us to warning signs. Friends asked if I would ever remarry, their voices cautious, as if the question itself might reopen a wound. I told them I wasn't opposed to love, but I was no longer interested in auditions. If someone entered my life again, it would be as a partner, not a project, not a dependent, and certainly not an owner. One day, a letter arrived from Victor's sister, handwritten, apologizing for her brother's behavior and admitting she had seen similar patterns before. She wrote that she hoped I was well and that I deserved better. I appreciated the honesty, even if it came late. The complex thrived that year. Vacancy rates dropped, tenants stayed longer, and the community garden I had approved became a gathering place in the evenings. Watching children play there, I felt a sense of continuity, of building something that would outlast individual disappointments. I began to share my story selectively, not as a cautionary tale about men, but as a reminder about self-worth. At a local women's group, I spoke about the importance of protecting one's assets and one's autonomy, especially later in life. The response was overwhelming. Questions, laughter, shared stories, and I realized how hungry people were for examples that didn't end in quiet compromise. Late one night, I walked the same hallway where my bags had once been lined up, now empty and clean, and I smiled at the memory. Not because it hurt, but because it no longer did. That moment had stripped away an illusion and left me standing in truth. I hadn't lost a husband. I had gained clarity. I hadn't hidden my wealth to deceive, but to observe, and what I observed had saved me from years of subtle erosion. The building, solid and familiar around me, felt like an extension of my own spine, upright, unyielding, and mine. As time went on, the story stopped feeling like something that had happened to me and started feeling like something I had moved through. That shift mattered. I no longer replayed the scene in the hallway with anger or disbelief, but with the detached clarity of someone who understands cause and effect. Victor's actions were no longer a mystery. They were a pattern. I began to notice how often society excuses that pattern, especially when it comes wrapped in charm or late-life romance. People would say things like, he was probably intimidated, or men his age aren't used to independent women, as if intimidation were a justification rather than a warning sign. I stopped engaging with those explanations. Instead, I focused on building routines that felt nourishing rather than defensive. My mornings started with long walks through the complex, greeting people by name, checking in not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Afternoons were for meetings and planning, evenings for quiet dinners or the occasional outing with friends. One such evening, a neighbor invited me to a small gathering, and there I met a retired teacher named Samuel. He was kind, attentive, and asked thoughtful questions without probing. When he learned what I did, he nodded and said it sounded like meaningful work. He did not ask how much it was worth. That alone told me everything I needed to know about him. We spoke occasionally after that. Nothing rushed, nothing loaded with expectation. I felt no urgency to define it. Peace had become more attractive to me than passion disguised as chaos. Meanwhile, Victor resurfaced in indirect ways. A mutual acquaintance mentioned he was struggling financially, that his sons had moved back in with him, that he often complained about being wronged. I felt a brief flicker of sadness, not for him, but for the version of myself that might once have tried to fix him. That version no longer existed. I had learned that love does not require self-erasure, and partnership does not begin with control. The complex continued to evolve. We installed solar panels on 2 buildings, upgraded the playground, and started a scholarship fund for tenants' children pursuing higher education. These decisions brought me more fulfillment than any grand romantic gesture ever had. They were quiet investments in stability and future, things I understood deeply. One afternoon, a young man from Building D stopped me to say thank you for approving his lease extension after a rough year. He said knowing he wouldn't have to move had given him the breathing room to get back on his feet. Moments like that reinforced my sense of purpose. They reminded me that ownership, when exercised with care, can be a form of stewardship rather than dominance. At a family dinner, my niece asked me why I never talk about Victor anymore. I told her that some chapters don't deserve rereading once the lesson is learned. She nodded, thoughtful, and later told me she hoped to be like me when she was older, unafraid to walk away. That comment stayed with me. I realized how important it is for younger women to see examples of boundaries enforced without apology, especially from those society often tells to settle. As the anniversary of the wedding came and went without ceremony, I marked it privately by taking a day off. I visited the beach, walked along the shore, and let the wind carry away any lingering residue of that time. I thought about how easily things could have gone differently if I had revealed my wealth early, how Victor might have masked his intentions longer, how I might have found myself entangled in legal battles or emotional compromise. Silence, in that case, had been a filter. It had revealed truth faster than disclosure ever could have. That realization did not harden me. It softened me toward myself. I stopped second-guessing my instincts and started trusting the quiet voice that had guided me all along. In conversations, I spoke more openly about finances, about planning, about the importance of prenuptial agreements, and transparency balanced with caution. Some people found it uncomfortable. I didn't mind. Comfort is often the enemy of honesty. One evening, Samuel and I sat on a bench in the courtyard, watching the lights come on across the complex. He asked me, gently, if I had ever regretted choosing independence over compromise. I smiled and told him independence was never the opposite of love, only of control. He nodded, understanding without needing further explanation. That, too, felt like progress. As I walked back upstairs that night, I felt grounded, not guarded. The building around me was quiet, secure, familiar. I unlocked my door, stepped inside, and closed it behind me with a sense of finality that had nothing to do with exclusion and everything to do with self-respect. There was a moment one afternoon when I realized how completely my life had shifted, and it happened during something very ordinary. I was sitting in a meeting with a group of local property owners, discussing zoning changes and tenant protections, when one of the men at the table turned to me and asked for my opinion first. Not as a courtesy, not because he felt obligated, but because he genuinely wanted to know what I thought. I spoke, and the room listened. Walking home afterward, I understood that respect, once lost, is hard to reclaim from others, but once claimed within yourself, it radiates outward in ways you cannot control. That confidence had been inside me all along, but it had taken the shock of almost losing everything to bring it fully into the open. I began mentoring a few younger women who were just starting out in property management, meeting them for coffee, reviewing contracts, answering questions I wished someone had answered for me years ago. They were sharp, ambitious, and cautious in the best way. When they asked about my marriage, I told them the truth without embellishment. I didn't frame myself as a victim or a hero. I framed it as a decision point, one where I chose myself. That distinction mattered. Around that time, Victor's name surfaced again, this time through a legal notice. He was disputing the annulment settlement, claiming he had been misled and deserved compensation. My lawyer handled it efficiently, filing a response that outlined the facts with precision. The claim was dismissed within weeks. When my lawyer called to tell me, I felt no triumph, only a quiet sense of closure. The situation had reached its natural end. I no longer felt pulled back into it emotionally. That chapter was sealed. I noticed that my days were filled now with intention rather than reaction. I planned projects months in advance, traveled occasionally, visited my daughter who lived out of state, and spent weekends reading or tending to the small garden on my balcony. People often mistake a calm life for an empty one, but mine felt full in ways that were difficult to explain. Samuel remained a gentle presence, never demanding more than I was willing to give. never pushing for labels or timelines. We shared meals, conversations, laughter, and silence. He once told me he admired how I carried myself, how I seemed both open and immovable. I understood what he meant. I was no longer flexible in ways that bent me out of shape. One evening, during a community meeting, a tenant raised her hand and asked how I had managed to build and keep what I had, especially as a woman, navigating spaces that often underestimated her. I answered honestly, saying it wasn't about strength alone, but about boundaries, patience, and the willingness to walk away when something felt wrong, even if it looked right on paper. The room was quiet after that, not awkwardly so, but thoughtfully. Later, several people approached me to continue the conversation. I realized then that my story had become less about betrayal and more about example. That felt meaningful. On the anniversary of buying the complex, I hosted a small celebration. Nothing extravagant, just food, music, and shared gratitude. As I stood there, watching people talk and laugh, I thought about how close I had come to letting someone dismantle all of this in a moment of entitlement. The image of my bags in the hallway surfaced again, but this time it felt distant, like a photograph from another life. I no longer identified with the woman who stood there stunned. I identified with the woman who stayed. At home that night, I wrote a letter to myself, something I had never done before. I wrote about what I had learned, about trust earned versus trust given freely, about the difference between loneliness and solitude, about how love should add weight to your life, not strip it away. I sealed it and tucked it into a drawer, a reminder for the future, should I ever need it. Aging, I realized, had given me something youth could not. Perspective sharpened by experience. I no longer feared being alone, and because of that, I was no longer vulnerable to being used. The world did not suddenly become kinder, but I became more discerning. As I prepared for bed, I looked around my apartment, the same walls, the same view, yet everything felt different. This space was no longer just a home or an asset. It was proof. Proof that resilience does not announce itself loudly, that wisdom often comes disguised as restraint, and that sometimes the greatest act of self-respect is allowing people to reveal themselves and then believing what you see. The story I once thought I would never tell has settled into something I carry lightly now, not as a warning etched in fear, but as a reminder etched in strength. People still ask me how I stayed so calm that morning, how I didn't break down when my marriage collapsed before it had even begun. The truth is, I did break, just not in the way people expect. Something brittle inside me finally snapped. The part that believed I needed to accommodate, explain, or soften myself to be loved. When that broke, everything else became clearer. Life after that did not transform into a fairy tale. It became something better, honest. I learned to recognize peace, not as the absence of conflict, but as the presence of self-respect. Every decision since then has been filtered through that understanding. When new opportunities arise, I ask whether they align with the life I am building, not whether they will impress anyone else. When people enter my orbit, I observe how they treat boundaries, how they react to hearing no, how they behave when they think nothing is at stake. Those details tell me more than declarations ever could. The complex continues to thrive, not just financially, but socially. Tenants look out for one another. Children grow up here. People age here. I see the long arc of lives unfolding, and it reminds me that stability is a gift, one I do not take lightly. Occasionally, someone new moves in and learns that I am the owner. Their surprise is familiar, almost amusing. I no longer hide it, but I also no longer lead with it. It is simply a fact, like my age or my name. What matters more is how I show up day to day. There are moments when I think about the woman I was at 55, standing in a wedding dress, the night before everything fell apart. I don't pity her. I admire her. She trusted herself enough to wait, to observe, to protect what she had built. She chose patience over performance, and that choice made all the difference. If I could speak to her now, I would tell her that the pain would pass, that the clarity would stay, and that the life waiting on the other side of that hallway would feel lighter than she could imagine. People often frame stories like mine as revenge tales, focusing on the shock of the reveal. The moment the men realized who I really was. That moment mattered, but it was not the point. The point was what came after, the quiet rebuilding of trust with myself, the reaffirmation that my worth was never up for negotiation. I did not win because they lost. I won because I refused to stay where I was not respected. That distinction is important. It is the difference between reacting and choosing. As I grow older, I find myself less interested in dramatic turning points and more appreciative of steady ground. Mornings with sunlight on the kitchen counter. Evenings with conversation that does not require armor. Work that feels purposeful. Relationships that feel reciprocal. These are not small things. They are the substance of a well-lived life. If someone hears my story and feels a stirring of recognition, a quiet nudge that something in their own life is misaligned, I hope they listen to it. You do not need to own buildings to claim your space. You only need the courage to believe that you deserve it. Standing up for yourself does not always look loud or confrontational. Sometimes it looks like silence, documentation, patience, and then a firm decision. Sometimes it looks like letting someone show you who they are and then acting accordingly. That morning in the hallway was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of a chapter defined not by what I hid, but by what I finally refused to give away. I live now with a sense of alignment that feels earned. I am not bitter. I am not closed off. I am simply clear. Clear about what I will tolerate. Clear about what I value. Clear about who I am. And that clarity, more than any property or asset, is the true wealth I protect.